Here are the top criminals who outsmarted the police. Number 10. D.B. Cooper. D.B. Cooper is perhaps the most secretive and elusive criminal ever to evade the police. November 24th, 1971, Cooper boarded a plane flying from Portland to Seattle. While on the flight, Cooper handed a note to the stewardess which said he had an explosive device. He demanded the modern equivalent of $1.3 million and 4 parachutes. The plane then lifted off from Seattle and began its flight to Reno, Nevada. Around 30 minutes after takeoff, Cooper opened the aft airplane door, lowered the stairs into the whistling night air, and leapt into the darkness. The hijacker initially identified himself as Dan Cooper. However, due to confusion during the investigation, he became known as D.B. Cooper. Cooper would never be found despite a manhunt involving military aircraft and helicopters, including the Mach 3 capable SR-71 Blackbird. However, despite all attempts, no evidence as to Cooper's whereabouts has been determined. Numerous bills from the ransom money were found in the Columbia River nearly a decade later, but despite this find, the case soon went cold again and Cooper escaped. There is no evidence of the ransom money turning up in circulation or of anyone matching Cooper's descriptions leaving the country. Whatever happened to him, he has definitely outsmarted every intelligence and law enforcement agency in the country. Number 9. Albert Spaghiari. Spaghiari had a wide-ranging life, serving first as a paratrooper in the First Indochina War before joining a far-right extremist group fighting against Algerian independence. For this, he spent 3.5 years in prison for political terror actions and afterwards moved to Nice with his wife and children. But it was in Nice that Spaghiari would commit his most infamous crime. Spaghiari began planning a heist on the Société Générale Bank in Nice after hearing that the sewers ran underneath it. He orchestrated a symphonic heist of what was supposedly an impregnable vault with a crew of old extremist buddies. They spent 2 months digging an 8-meter tunnel under the bank, and during the Bastille Day long weekend, the crew broke into the main vault and cracked 400 safety deposit boxes and stole up to 100 million francs worth of money and valuables. They then welded the doors shut from inside and had a picnic lunch of wine and pâté before they wrote "without weapons, neither hatred nor violence" on the walls and fled the scene. It took a long time, but after several months, the French police were closing in. Spaghiari was implicated after a crew member was interrogated, and he was brought in for trial. Spaghiari invented a piece of encoded evidence, and while the judge was distracted examining it, Spaghiari jumped out of the courtroom window and fled on a motorcycle to freedom. Supposedly, he died under mysterious circumstances, but Spaghiari has never been found or identified since and evaded the police for the rest of his life. Number 8. Natwarlal. As a teen, Natwarlal was tasked by a neighbor with depositing his bank drafts, and there discovered his ability for forgery, stealing 1,000 rupees from his neighbor before fleeing to Calcutta. There, he enrolled as a Bachelor of Commerce while casually trading as a stockbroker. Natwarlal had an intimate knowledge of the freight and railway lines, as well as his knowledge of financial dealings and stock trading, which allowed him to engage in numerous cons. In 1937, he stole 9 tons of iron, but was soon arrested for it, not having learned how to cover his tracks yet. His dozens of cons are too numerous to relate here, but Natwarlal was a massively successful fraudster who got away with some insanely high-profile cons. Once, he sold the entire Parliament House, including the members of Parliament themselves, to a foreigner. He sold other monuments like the Taj Mahal to gullible foreigners and escaped from police custody up to 10 times throughout his career. He was last arrested in 1996 at 84 years old, and despite his use of a wheelchair, he managed to escape captivity again. It's unknown how he escaped, but he was never recaptured and had a warrant for his arrest for 100 different charges. In 2006, his lawyer asked that the charges be dropped as he had passed away, but Natwarlal hasn't been confirmed as deceased. Number 7. Arno Funk. Funke was a painter by trade, but began his criminal career in 1988 when he needed startup money to open a sausage vendor cart on the German streets. Born in East Berlin, he accomplished his first ransom when he planted a small explosive in a West Berlin department store and phoned in from East Berlin. Because of the Iron Curtain divide and wall between East and West Berlin, the police institutions were not integrated or cooperative with one another, allowing Funke to escape investigation. Sometimes he would set off his explosives if he wasn't given enough money or if they didn't obey his blackmailing, though none of the explosions ever harmed anyone. Using the German name for Scrooge McDuck, Dagobert, he would continue a string of ransoms to much public acclaim and fame. People even began selling I Am Dagobert t-shirts in solidarity. He was finally caught after dozens of close calls and sentenced to 9 years in prison. However, he was released after only 6 years due to good behavior. He had cost the police $20 million in the search and was forced to be released a day early to avoid the massive crowds that were sure to gather. Since 1998, he has worked as a cartoonist and author and has participated in numerous TV shows and game show heists. Perhaps the smartest convict on this list, as he can now bask in his fame while living a completely free life. Number 6. Frank Matthews. Also known as Black Caesar, Frank Matthews was a substance trafficker who operated in 21 states and has been ranked among the top 10 substance traffickers in US history. Matthews was keen on breaking the Italian mafia hold on the substance trade and was instrumental in establishing and expanding trade with the Cuban mafia. By the early 1970s, Matthew and his crew were moving multi-million-dollar shipments of narcotics and had become one of the largest distributors in all of New York. He was arrested in Miami while trying to move 40 pounds of narcotics and was posted on a $5 million bail. This was reduced to $2.5 million when he accepted extradition to New York and was again reduced to $325,000 after a few weeks. He was charged with 6 counts of tax evasion and conspiracy to transport Class A narcotics and was faced with 50 years in prison. However, when Matthews' court date arrived for the trial, he simply didn't show up. It took law enforcement far too long to determine that he had taken out $20 million and simply fled the country. He has never been seen since and has not contacted his wife or children. As far as police can tell, he has vanished. There were rumors that he was lured out to the Bahamas by the Genovese crime family and was murdered there, either to keep him silent or to aid in expanding the Genovese substance trade. Number 5. Victor Manuel Garena. Little is known about Victor's early life. By all accounts, he was just a regular guy living in New York. At some point, though, he was part of the Los Macheteros, a militant group which sought the liberation of Puerto Rico from American control. In service of his organization, he started working at a Wells Fargo armored truck facility as a driver and was instrumental in the 1983 White Eagle armed robbery. Due to cost-cutting measures and a general lack of safety measures and protocols, some $30 million were stored in the Wells Fargo vault, managed by an inexperienced guard who Garena knew well. Garena convinced him to let him leave his car there overnight, and Garena then went out on his daily cash run and returned to find his manager waiting for his set of keys to open the vault with a fully loaded truck just sitting in the parking lot. Garena then disarmed the other 2 guards in the facility who initially thought it was a joke before he bound them and stole over $7 million before fleeing. Police initially didn't pursue Garena, believing his arrest to be easy since his identity was known, but they weren't prepared for Garena to exchange the cash with Puerto Rican separatists for forged documents, which got him out of the country. He was put on the FBI's most wanted list for 36 years, but he was never found or arrested. Number 4. Eleanor Jarman. Eleanor Jarman was born in 1901 as the youngest of 8 to a poor family. In her mid-20s, she married Leroy Jarman and had 2 children. However, not long after, he abandoned her and the kids, and she moved to Chicago. There she met George Dale, who helped her support her children. Eleanor claimed she had no idea that Dale supported them off of his thefts and burglaries, but by 1933 at least, she was an active participant in his thefts. In 1933, the 2 of them, with one of Dale's friends, tried to rob a clothing store, during which Dale shot and ended the life of the owner of the store. Following a brief manhunt, all 3 criminals were arrested and brought to trial. The press and prosecution made Eleanor out to be the leader of the group, manipulating George Dale into the crime and dubbed her the Blonde Tigress. Dale was sentenced to death and Eleanor to 199 years in prison, the longest prison sentence ever at the time. For 7 years, Eleanor was a model prisoner. However, in 1940, she heard news that her son was planning on running away from home and decided to act. Details are slim, but we know that she escaped with Mary Foster, another inmate, and went back to Sioux City to see her son. After ensuring her family was okay, she went underground. For the next 35 years, Eleanor stayed in hiding and maintained contact with her family through the classified section of the newspaper. In 1975, she used the newspaper to arrange a meeting with her children, which was the first time she had seen them since 1940. In 1990, the contact slowly tapered off, and it is assumed that she has since passed away. Although Jarman was never pardoned, there is no ongoing investigation, as she would be 122 years old by now. The fact she not only escaped and remained uncaptured, but also managed to maintain more of a presence in her children's lives than most parents in prison, shows just how smart she was. Number 3. Christopher Dale Flannery. Christopher Flannery was an Australian hitman and career criminal and sometime bodyguard for criminal George Freeman. At 17, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison for SA and assault, and when he got out, he initially spent some time as a bouncer, before becoming bored with it and deciding to be a contract murderer. Flannery would commit perhaps a dozen murders and was closely embroiled with the Sydney gang war. Police attempted to negotiate an end to the war, but Flannery refused to stop murdering and even threatened police, saying, "You're not a protected species, you know. You're not a bloody koala." At the peak of the violence, Flannery's family home would be attacked by shooters, though there were no fatalities. Following this, he moved into an apartment close to Australian police headquarters and was then contacted by George Freeman, who convinced him to get into a taxi to come meet him. That was the last anyone saw Flannery. Some believe he was picked up by police and relocated as part of a witness protection program. Others believe he was ended by his old boss, George Freeman. One of the most plausible answers is that Flannery was murdered by his own gang for his out-of-control bloodlust and refusal to follow orders. He was simply seen as a liability. Yet, despite all his adventures, he avoided being charged for a dozen murders and was acquitted in trial numerous times, allowing him to evade police custody. Number 2. Roberto Solis. Roberto Solis specialized in robbing armored cars, and had already been served a 23-year sentence in 1969 for armed robbery and murder in Nicaragua. While in prison, he would publish 6 different poetry anthologies and poems from 3 different aliases. However, when he was released on parole, he went right back to planning more armored car robberies. He convinced his new girlfriend to get a job as a security guard at an armored car facility, and in October 1993, Solis's girlfriend followed his instructions to drive off the designated route with $3.1 million in the car, and then went on the run as fast as they could. They had a child together and would stay on the run for over 10 years until Heather, his girlfriend, gave herself up in 2005. In 2006, she was sentenced to 63 months in prison. However, Solis was never found and is still at large. Number 1. John Rufo. Born to a working-class family in New York, Rufo would get a degree in computer science in 1980 before marrying his childhood sweetheart Linda and starting his own computing firm. In 1992, he became close friends with one Edward Reiners, who was a former executive at Philip Morris, a tobacco company. Together, they planned a scheme to con banks into investigating into their highly secretive Project Star, which would produce smokeless cigarettes. Because of the highly secretive and clandestine nature, the banks were told not to contact Philip Morris directly and to only liaise with Rufo and Reiners. Rufo held up the scheme for 4 years by making timely interest payments on the loans. However, one of his forged checks was investigated and eventually sent up to the FBI. The whole scheme rapidly began to unravel when Philip Morris was contacted and notified the banks that they had no involvement in the scheme. Altogether, the scheme generated $350 million, equivalent to $600 million today, and it's believed some $40 million was directly appropriated by Rufo himself. His entire family put up their homes as collateral for his $10 million bail to allow him freedom pre-trial. However, Rufo simply abandoned them, leading to their homes being seized, essentially rendering his entire family, including his wife and children, homeless. Despite abandoning his entire family, Rufo was never found and always managed to stay one step ahead of the police. There is currently a $25,000 reward for information leading to his arrest.